November 2nd, 1943. 28,000 feet above Rabaul. 11B. 25 Mitchell bombers lumber through thin air toward the most heavily defended Japanese stronghold in the South Pacific. Below them, 37 Zero fighters claw skyward like metal hornets, hungry for American blood. The escort, 12P, 38 Lightnings, should be enough. By the book, they should be enough. But the math is about to turn brutal, and Lieutenant Robert "Bobby" Haynes is about to do something his commanding officer explicitly forbade him from ever attempting again. He reaches for the flap lever. His wingman's voice crackles through the radio. "Bobby, don't you dare. That'll kill us all." Haynes hesitates for one heartbeat. Below, the first Zero opens fire on the lead bomber. Smoke pours from the Mitchell's starboard engine. 29 more Zeros are climbing fast. Haynes grips the forbidden lever. The survival of 11 crews, 77 American airmen, now depends on a flap setting that every manual says will tear his wings off at altitude. He pulls. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The South Pacific in late 1943 is a cauldron of steel and fire. Rabaul, on the eastern tip of New Britain Island, squats like a fortress in the Solomon Sea. The Japanese have carved 5 airfields from jungle and coral, protected by more than 300 aircraft, and the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses outside the Japanese home islands. It is a place where American bombers go to die. The 5th Air Force has been bleeding here for months. The mathematics are unforgiving. 25 Mitchells, flying at 220 miles per hour, need 4 minutes to reach their targets and escape. Japanese Zeros, climbing at 2,700 feet per minute, can intercept them in 90 seconds. 38 Lightning escorts help, but they cannot be everywhere at once. The bombers are too slow, the defenders too many, the sky too vast. At Dobadura Airfield in New Guinea, the smell never changes. Aviation fuel mixed with jungle rot, cordite fumes from the bomb dump, and the sweet sick stench of hydraulic fluid baking on hot aluminum. B-25s taxi past foxholes and anti-aircraft pits, their twin engines coughing blue smoke. Mechanics work in 100-degree heat, patching bullet holes with whatever they can find. There is no depot-level maintenance here. No luxury of spare parts. A bomber returns with an engine shot out. They patch the cowling and send it back up. Henderson Field on Guadalcanal serves as the forward staging area. 38 pilots sleep 4 to a tent, listening to the distant rumble of Japanese night bombers. At dawn, they strap into cockpits that still smell of yesterday's sweat and terror. The Lightnings are fast, well-armed, and tough, but they are also complex. 2 engines, 2 turbo superchargers, counter-rotating propellers. When they work, nothing can catch them. When they don't, pilots die. This is the world where doctrine must bend to reality or men burn in aluminum coffins. Where 30 seconds of confusion can mean the difference between mission success and wholesale slaughter. And it is here, in this narrow margin between survival and annihilation, that one pilot begins to question everything the manual tells him about high-altitude flight. If this history matters to you, tap like and subscribe. Lieutenant Robert Eugene Haynes does not look like a revolutionary. 22 years old, thin as a fence post, with the kind of pale complexion that burns instead of tans in the Pacific sun. Born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the son of a telephone lineman and a schoolteacher. Before the war, he fixed radios in his father's basement workshop, building crystal sets from salvaged parts, teaching himself the mathematics of frequency and amplitude. He has gentle hands and curious eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses that fog in the cockpit humidity. He enlists in December 1941, 3 days after Pearl Harbor, not out of rage or patriotism, but because the Army Air Forces offers flight training and Bobby Haynes has dreamed of understanding how things work in 3 dimensions since he was 12 years old. He wants to know why a wing generates lift, how a propeller bites into thin air, what happens to control authority at the edge of a stall. Flight school reveals him to be methodical, precise, the kind of cadet who reads the entire manual before touching the controls. His instructors note that he flies with mathematical calm, never over-controlling, never chasing the gauges. During instrument training, while other cadets fight vertigo and spatial disorientation, Haynes trusts his gauges with the faith of a man who understands that physics does not lie. He earns his wings at Luke Field, Arizona, in August 1942. He is assigned to P-38 Lightnings, not because he requested fighters, but because the Army Air Forces needs pilots who can handle complex systems. The P-38 is the most sophisticated aircraft in American service: twin engines, twin booms, tricycle landing gear, and a flight envelope that can kill the unwary in a dozen different ways. At Muroc Dry Lake, he learns to fly the Lightning. The aircraft is 52 feet of aluminum and steel, powered by two Allison V-1710 engines that generate 1,425 horsepower each. In the thin air above 25,000 feet, those engines are breathing through turbo superchargers that compress atmosphere into something the cylinders can burn. It is an elegant system when it works. When it doesn't, pilots have been known to flame out both engines trying to follow doctrine. Haynes studies the technical manuals with the intensity of a seminary student. He learns that the P-38's wing flaps are hydraulically actuated, designed for takeoff and landing at low air speeds. Above 250 miles per hour, the manual states clearly, flap deployment is prohibited. The loads exceed design limits. The control forces become unmanageable. At altitude, where the air is thin and the engines are already working at maximum efficiency, any increase in drag can cause compressibility effects that rip wings from airframes. He accepts this. He understands the engineering. But late at night in the ready room, sketching diagrams of airflow and pressure differentials, he begins to wonder. The manual assumes standard atmospheric conditions, standard airspeeds, standard scenarios. But war is not standard. War is chaos with physics equations underneath. And sometimes those equations suggest possibilities that no engineer ever tested. In March 1943, he is shipped to the Pacific as part of the 9th Fighter Squadron, flying missions out of Henderson Field. His first combat sortie is an escort mission to Rabaul. He watches Japanese Zeros climb out of nowhere, slashing through bomber formations like sharks through a school of fish. The P-38s dive to help, but they are too far away. Two B-25s go down in flames. 18 men die because the math does not add up. That night, Haynes sketches diagrams in the dirt outside his tent. Climb rates, intercept angles, time-distance calculations. The problem is geometric. The bombers are predictable. The Zeros know their speed, their altitude, their course. They position themselves accordingly, climbing into perfect intercept positions while the escorts are still repositioning. But what if the escorts could buy more time? What if they could create confusion at the moment of interception? What if they could do something that no Zero pilot would expect from a P-38 at 28,000 feet? He begins to test it, not in combat, but during routine patrols, when he is alone and high, where a mistake will not kill anyone but himself. He climbs to 30,000 feet, throttles back to 200 miles per hour, and drops the flaps to the first detent. The Lightning shudders, wallows, feels like it wants to fall out of the sky, but it does not stall. The nose pitches down, the drag increases dramatically, but the control response remains positive. More importantly, the turn radius tightens. Not much, but enough to notice. He tries it again. Full flaps this time. The effect is more pronounced. The P-38 slows to 180 miles per hour, hanging on the edge of a stall, but the turn rate increases significantly. In a climbing spiral, where every degree of heading change matters, those few extra degrees per second might be enough to reverse a disadvantageous position. But there are costs. The engines run hot. Manifold pressure drops as the superchargers struggle to maintain boost. Fuel consumption increases. And if something goes wrong, if the hydraulics fail or the flaps stick, recovery might be impossible. The pilot's handbook is explicit about this. At altitude, flap deployment is a potential death sentence. Still, Haynes keeps testing. He learns the limits. He feels the edge where control response degrades, where the engines start to overheat, where the airframe begins to buffet. He discovers that at 28,000 feet, partial flap deployment for 30 seconds will not kill him. It will not even permanently damage the aircraft. But it will change the Lightning's flight characteristics in ways that might confuse an enemy pilot who expects standard performance. He mentions it to his wingman, Lieutenant Dave Morrison, during a quiet moment between missions. Morrison listens, frowns, and tells him it sounds like a good way to flame out both engines and crater in the jungle. Haynes agrees it is risky. He also points out that getting shot down by Zeros is risky too. And that's exactly what's happening to American pilots who follow doctrine in an asymmetric fight. Morrison reports the conversation to their squadron commander, Major William "Pappy" Klein. Klein is a veteran of the European theater, a careful man who has seen too many young pilots die trying to reinvent aerodynamics in combat. He calls Haynes into his office. The conversation is brief. Klein explains that the P-38's limitations are not suggestions. They are engineering realities proven by test pilots who understand more about high-altitude flight than a 22-year-old from Iowa. Flaps above 250 miles per hour are forbidden. Flaps at altitude are forbidden. Experimentation with forbidden procedures is forbidden. Do not try it again. Do not teach it to other pilots. Do not discuss it in the ready room. Haynes nods, says he understands, and requests permission to return to duty. But understanding and agreement are two different things. That night, Haynes sits on his cot and calculates. 11 B-25s, 6 men per crew, 66 lives per mission. 12 P-38s, 2 pilots per aircraft if you count the photo reconnaissance variants, 24 more lives. 90 American airmen flying into the teeth of enemy defenses with tactics that assume the enemy will cooperate. But the Japanese do not cooperate. They climb faster, position better, attack with numerical superiority and local knowledge. The only American advantage is technology, and technology is worthless if doctrine prevents its optimal employment. Haynes does not argue with Major Klein. He simply continues flying the way he knows might work. The Japanese defense of Rabaul is a masterpiece of tactical coordination. 5 airfields, Vinakino, Rapopo, Tobara, Lakanai, and the seaplane base at Karavia Bay, spread across a 30-mile arc of coastline. More than 300 aircraft, including 150 A-6M0 fighters flown by pilots who have been fighting since 1941. They know every approach route, every bombing altitude, every escort pattern the Americans fly. Japanese radar stations track incoming raids from 200 miles out. Fighter commanders plot intercept courses with mathematical precision. They position their aircraft not where the bombers are, but where the bombers will be when the climbing fighters reach attack altitude. By the time American pilots see the threat, the geometry is already in the enemy's favor. The Zero itself is a weapon designed for this kind of fight. Light, agile, with a service ceiling above 38,000 feet, and a climb rate that can bring it from sea level to bomber altitude in less than 10 minutes. Its 20mm cannons can destroy a B-25 with a 2-second burst. Its 7.7mm machine guns can kill engines, rupture fuel tanks, and wound crews through aluminum that was never meant to stop bullets. American bomber doctrine assumes fighter escorts will engage and destroy interceptors before they reach the bombers. This works in Europe, where bases are close and fuel allows for extended dogfights. But the Pacific is different. Distances are measured in hundreds of miles. Fuel is precious. P-38s cannot loiter at altitude, burning gas and turning fights while bombers continue toward heavily defended targets. They must engage, kill, and disengage, allowing the bombers to complete their runs before enemy reinforcements arrive. But what happens when 37 Zeros intercept 12 P-38s? The mathematics are brutal. Even if every American pilot shoots down 3 enemies, an impossible ratio, the bombers still face 10 fresh fighters with full ammunition and local fuel advantages. The mission becomes a choice between pressing the attack and losing everyone, or aborting and accomplishing nothing. The loss rates prove this. Between August and October 1943, 5th Air Force Bomber Commands lose an average of 18% of aircraft per mission over heavily defended targets. That means 1 bomber crew in 5 does not come home. For the men flying those missions, it means watching friends die not because they lack courage or skill, but because the tactical situation is mathematically impossible. Major Klein knows this. He also knows that desperation breeds innovation, and innovation in combat usually means dead pilots. He has read after-action reports from European squadrons where crews tried unauthorized modifications, non-standard procedures, tactical experiments that seemed logical on paper but killed men in practice. High-altitude flap deployment is exactly the kind of idea that gets people killed. The manual forbids it for reasons written in the blood of test pilots who learn the hard way that some limits cannot be safely exceeded. But doctrine also forbids losing 18% of your bomber's permission. Doctrine forbids letting enemy fighters climb uncontested into perfect intercept positions. Doctrine forbids a lot of things that are happening anyway. The Japanese understand this better than the Americans. Their tactical intelligence, gathered from captured aircrews and wreckage analysis, shows that American pilots are predictable. P-38s will escort at 2,000 feet above bomber altitude. They will engage climbing fighters with diving attacks. They will attempt to break up formations through superior firepower and speed. They will not attempt close-quarters maneuvering because the Lightning is not designed for knife fights. Zero pilots train specifically to exploit these predictable patterns. They bait P-38s into diving attacks, then scatter before regrouping behind the escorts. They climb in multiple waves, forcing the Americans to choose between targets while fresh fighters position for subsequent attacks. They use altitude and position to dictate the terms of engagement, fighting only when they have numerical and geometric advantages. The key insight is timing. Japanese fighters need 90 seconds from initial visual contact to reach firing position on a bomber formation. American escorts need 45 seconds to dive from covering altitude to intercept position. That 45-second gap is where bombers die. If the escorts could somehow buy more time, if they could force enemy fighters to hesitate, to second-guess, to spend crucial seconds repositioning instead of attacking, the geometric advantage might shift. But buying time requires doing something the enemy does not expect. And in November 1943, no Zero pilot expects to see a P-38 Lightning deploying flaps at 28,000 feet. The technical manual for the P-38H Lightning is explicit about flap limitations. Section 4, paragraph 12. Combat flaps are not to be deployed above 250 miles per hour indicated airspeed or above 15,000 feet pressure altitude. The engineering reasoning is sound. At high altitude, the reduced air density means that any increase in drag can cause compressibility effects. The airframe will shudder. Control forces will become unmanageable. In extreme cases, structural failure is possible. But Haynes has read beyond the limitations. He has studied the wind tunnel data, the load calculations, the test reports that inform those restrictions. And buried in the technical appendices, he finds something interesting. The flap prohibition is based on continuous deployment in standard atmospheric conditions with standard pilot inputs. The tests assumed pilots would lower flaps and leave them down, fighting the increased drag and altered control response throughout an extended maneuver. No one tested what would happen if flaps were deployed briefly, tactically, for 15 or 20 seconds during a specific phase of flight. No one tested partial deployment at altitude, first detent only, rather than full extension. And no one tested deployment during a climbing turn, where the reduced forward airspeed might offset some of the drag penalty. Haynes begins to understand that engineering limitations and tactical possibilities are two different things. The P-38's wing flaps increase the effective camber of the airfoil, creating more lift at lower airspeeds. In a climbing turn, where airspeed is already bleeding away, that extra lift might allow a tighter turning radius without stalling. The drag penalty would be severe, but if the maneuver lasted only long enough to spoil an enemy's deflection calculation, the aircraft might recover normal flight characteristics before the engines overheated or the controls became unmanageable. He tests this theory during routine patrols, always at altitude where a mistake will not endanger other pilots. He climbs to 30,000 feet, reduces throttle to simulate combat conditions, and enters a climbing left turn. At the moment when the P-38 would normally reach the edge of its performance envelope, he drops the flaps to the first detent. The effect is immediate. The nose pitches down slightly, requiring back pressure on the elevator. The airspeed bleeds from 180 miles per hour to 160, then 150. The engines struggle, manifold pressure dropping as the turbo superchargers fight to maintain boost pressure. But the turn radius tightens measurably. Instead of a wide, shallow arc, the Lightning pulls through a tighter spiral, changing heading at a rate that would surprise anyone calculating deflection from external observation. After 20 seconds, He retracts the flaps. The nose pitches up. Airspeed builds. The engines recover their power settings. Within 30 seconds, the P-38 is back to normal flight characteristics, but it has changed direction by perhaps 15 degrees more than standard performance would allow. 15 degrees. In a high-speed intercept, where enemy fighters calculate approach angles based on observed flight path, 15 degrees might be enough to spoil a firing solution. It might force the attacker to reposition, buying precious seconds for bombers to complete their runs or for other escorts to intervene. But the costs are significant. Engine temperatures spike during flap deployment. Fuel consumption increases dramatically. The pilot must manage throttles, mixture controls, and flap retraction while maintaining formation and scanning for threats. And if something goes wrong, if the hydraulic system fails or the pilot mismanages the recovery, the aircraft will enter an unrecoverable stall at altitude where bailout might not be possible. Still, Haynes continues to refine the technique. He learns that partial deployment works better than full extension. He discovers that the maneuver works best in a climbing turn, where the reduced airspeed allows the flaps to be effective without creating unmanageable control forces. He realizes that timing is everything. Deploy too early and the enemy sees it coming. Deploy too late and there is not enough time to affect the intercept geometry. Most importantly, he learns that the technique only works once per engagement. The element of surprise is crucial. An enemy pilot who has seen a P-38 deploy flaps in combat will be prepared for it next time. This is not a repeatable tactic. It is a desperate gambit for desperate situations. He mentions his experiments to his wingman, Morrison, during a pre-flight briefing in early October. Morrison listens, shakes his head, and says it sounds like a good way to flame out and crash. Haynes agrees it is risky, but points out that following standard doctrine against superior numbers is risky too. Morrison asks if he has cleared it with Major Klein. Haynes admits he has not. That evening, Morrison approaches Major Klein privately. The conversation is brief. Klein thanks Morrison for the information, then calls Haynes into his office the next morning. "Lieutenant, I'm told you've been experimenting with combat flap deployment at altitude." "Yes, sir. Partial deployment during climbing turns. Brief duration only. Are you familiar with the technical limitations outlined in the pilot's handbook?" "Yes, sir. I've studied them extensively." "And you believe your understanding of high-altitude aerodynamics exceeds that of Lockheed's test pilots?" "No, sir. I believe combat conditions create scenarios that test pilots don't evaluate, such as tactical surprise, sir, creating momentary confusion in enemy deflection calculations during the critical phase of an intercept." Klein stares at him for a long moment. "Lieutenant, the limitations in that handbook are written in blood. Test pilots have died proving where the boundaries are. Your job is to fly the aircraft within those boundaries, not to test new ones in combat. With respect, sir, pilots are dying following Doctrine 2. If there's a way to improve our survival rates, there is. It's called following procedures that have been proven to work. Flaps above 250 miles per hour are forbidden. Flaps at altitude are forbidden. Experimentation with either is grounds for grounding. Are we clear?" "Yes, sir. I don't want to hear about this again, Lieutenant. You're a good pilot. Don't throw your career away on a stunt that'll probably kill you." "Understood, sir. But understanding and compliance are two different things." Haynes returns to his tent that night and calculates intercept geometries on the back of a weather report. The Japanese fighters climb at 2,700 feet per minute. American bombers cruise at 18,000 feet. P-38 escorts fly at 20,000 feet. The mathematics are unforgiving. By the time the escorts reach intercept position, the enemy has had 45 seconds to line up perfect deflection shots on bombers that cannot maneuver effectively. Unless something disrupts that deflection calculation. Unless the escort aircraft does something no enemy pilot expects, forcing him to recompute angles and closure rates during the critical phase of the attack. Even a momentary disruption might be enough to spoil the shot, to force the attacker to break off and reposition, to buy enough time for the bombers to complete their runs. The technique exists. Haynes has tested it. He knows the risks and the limitations. But he also knows that Major Klein is right. Experimenting in combat will probably kill him. The smart move is to follow orders, fly by the book, and trust that superior technology will eventually overcome enemy advantages. Haynes is not particularly smart. He is curious, methodical, and convinced that mathematics do not lie. And the mathematics say that continuing to lose 18% of bomber crews per mission is unacceptable, even if saving them requires violating every limitation in the pilot's handbook. He does not argue with Major Klein again. He simply continues flying the way he knows might work. November 2nd, 1943, 06:30 hours. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. The briefing tent smells of coffee, cigarettes, and mildew. 11B, 25 Mitchell bombers will hit the seaplane facilities at Caravia Bay. 12P, 38 Lightnings will provide escort. Time over target, 1,245 hours. Weather, scattered clouds at 8,000 feet, unlimited visibility above 15,000. Major Klein points to a large map tacked to a plywood board. Rabaul sits at the tip of New Britain Island like a malignant tumor, surrounded by concentric circles marking anti-aircraft ranges and fighter patrol zones. Intelligence estimates 200-plus enemy aircraft operational. Expect heavy opposition from takeoff to landing. Stay with the bombers. Do not pursue individual targets. Your job is to get them to the target and home again. The bomber pilots look tired. They have been flying these missions for months, watching friends disappear into the Solomon Sea, patching holes, and flying aircraft that should have been retired weeks ago. Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, no relation to Haynes' wingman, commands the B-25 formation. He is 28 years old and looks 50. His crew chief counted 247 bullet holes in his aircraft after the last Rabaul mission. They patched them with aluminum cut from wrecked bombers. Haynes sits in the third row, listening to the route details, the timing, the emergency procedures. Standard doctrine. Climb to 18,000 feet for the bombers, 20,000 for the escorts. Approach from the southeast to avoid the heaviest flak concentrations. Attack in trail formation, each bomber making its run individually to avoid clustering in the target area. Egress northwest toward friendly territory. Flight time, 2 hours 45 minutes. The intelligence officer, a pale captain who has never flown combat, points to reconnaissance photos showing the target. Seaplane base at Caravia Bay. 12 to 15 Kawanishi flying boats moored in the harbor. Unknown number of fighters based at adjacent airfields. Flak installations here, here, and here. His pointer taps locations on the grainy photographs. Questions. Lieutenant Morrison, Haynes' wingman, raises his hand. What's the latest fighter count? Estimated 150 operational. Mix of Zeros and Tony fighters. They've been reinforcing from truck. Escort to fighter ratio? Approximately 12 to 1 against. But intelligence believes they won't commit everything to a single intercept. Nervous laughter from the bomber pilots. They know better. The Japanese will throw everything they have at a formation this size. At 0745, engines start with puffs of blue smoke and the sharp bark of radial engines coming to life. The B-25s lumber to the runway first. Their twin right are 2,600s developing 1,700 horsepower each. 60,000 pounds of aircraft, fuel, bombs, and ammunition. They take off in pairs, climbing slowly into the dawn sky. The P-38s follow. Haynes straps into the cockpit of Iowa Farm Boy, his usual aircraft, tail number 42 to 68,192. The pre-flight checklist is automatic. Fuel, hydraulics, engines, controls, weapons. 2 Allison V-1710s spinning up to idle. For .50 caliber machine guns and 120mm cannon charged and armed. 300 rounds per gun. Enough for 15 seconds of sustained fire. He taxis into position behind Morrison. The runway at Henderson is 5,000 feet of steel planking laid over coral gravel. At the far end, wrecked Japanese aircraft serve as morbid decorations, pushed aside to clear the landing area. Haynes advances the throttles. The P-38 accelerates smoothly, twin props biting into humid air. At 120 miles per hour, he lifts off, retracts the gear, and begins a climbing turn to join formation. The flight to Rabaul is routine. 12 Lightnings in loose formation spread across 2 miles of sky. Below them, 11 B-25s maintain precise intervals, their bombardiers already studying approach charts and target photos. The ocean stretches endlessly blue-green, broken only by coral atolls and the occasional Japanese barge trying to resupply isolated garrisons. At 1,200 hours, Rabaul appears on the horizon. 5 plumes of smoke mark the airfields. The harbor is crowded with shipping. Even from 40 miles out, the island looks malevolent, a fortified position that has swallowed hundreds of American aircrew. Bandits, 11 o'clock high. Morrison's voice cuts through the radio static. Count them. Jesus. I make it 30 plus. Haynes scans left and up. There they are, a swarm of dark specks climbing out of Rabaul's airspace, angling to intercept the bomber formation. More than 30, perhaps as many as 40. The Japanese have committed everything. Major Klein's voice on the command frequency. Lightning flight. Prepare to engage. Stay with the bombers. Do not get drawn into individual fights. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the geometry is already wrong. The Japanese fighters are climbing faster than expected, positioning themselves not behind the formation but ahead of it, setting up for head-on attacks that will scatter the bombers before they reach the target. The P-38s will have to abandon their covering position to intercept, leaving the bombers vulnerable to follow-up attacks. Haynes feels his heart rate spike. Adrenaline sharpens his vision, narrows his focus to the developing tactical situation. 37 enemy fighters against 11 bombers and 12 escorts. The mathematics are impossible unless something changes the equation. At 12:15, the leading Zeros begin their attack runs. They dive from 25,000 feet, building speed for slashing attacks on the bomber formation. Standard Japanese tactics: attack the escorts first, force them to break formation, then massacre the unprotected bombers. Lightning 1 engaging. Klein rolls inverted and dives toward the lead group of Zeros. 3 more P-38s follow. The remaining 8 escorts, including Haynes, maintain position above the bombers, but they are spread too thin. 8 fighters cannot protect 11 bombers from 30-plus attackers. The first Zero reaches firing range on the lead B-25. Tracers stream past the bomber's nose. The Mitchell's top gunner returns fire, his twin .50s hammering short bursts. The Zero breaks left, climbs, and comes around for another pass. More Zeros dive in from different angles. The sky fills with aircraft, tracer bullets, and the smoke trails of damaged engines. A B-25 in the second element takes hits in the starboard wing. Fuel streams behind it like a comet's tail. The pilot holds formation, but Haynes can see the bomber settling, losing altitude gradually. Morrison's voice. Bobby, we've got 6 more coming in from 2 o'clock high. They're setting up for a bracket attack. Haynes looks right. 6 Zeros in trail formation, climbing to position themselves for coordinated attacks from multiple angles. If they succeed, the bomber formation will disintegrate. Individual B-25s will be hunted down like wounded animals. This is the moment. Standard doctrine says to dive and engage, to use the P-38's speed advantage to disrupt the attack formation. But 6 more Zeros are climbing from below, and another group is positioning for attacks from the left. Engaging one group leaves the bombers vulnerable to the others. Haynes makes his decision. Instead of diving to attack, he pulls back on the stick, climbing above the bomber formation. Morrison follows, confused. Bobby, what are you doing? We need to engage. Stay with me. Trust me. Haynes climbs to 28,000 feet, positioning himself directly above the bomber formation as the 6 Zeros begin their attack dive. He rolls inverted, points the nose down, and begins his own dive to intercept. Standard attack profile. The Zeros see him coming but do not break off. They have numbers and position. 1 P-38 cannot stop 6 fighters. At 24,000 feet, with his airspeed building through 350 miles per hour, Haynes does something no Japanese pilot expects. He reaches for the flap lever and drops the combat flaps to the first detent. The P-38 shudders violently. The nose pitches down despite full back pressure on the elevator. Airspeed bleeds from 350 to 280, then 250 miles per hour. The drag increase is enormous, like flying through molasses. But the aircraft's flight path changes dramatically. Instead of a shallow diving attack, the Lightning pulls through a tight, descending spiral that puts Haynes behind the lead Zero in under 8 seconds. What the hell? Morrison's voice cuts off as he watches his wingman's aircraft perform a maneuver that should be aerodynamically impossible. The lead Zero pilot sees the P-38 suddenly appear in his rearview mirror and brakes hard left, abandoning his attack on the bombers. The other 5 Zeros scatter, confused by the Lightning's impossible flight path. Their coordinated attack becomes a chaotic scramble as pilots try to reposition for individual fights. Haynes retracts the flaps. Airspeed builds rapidly. He rolls right, following the braking Zero, and fires a 2-second burst. The 20mm cannon shells tear through the fighter's wing root. The Zero rolls inverted and spins toward the ocean, trailing white smoke. But the technique has cost him altitude and speed. 2 more Zeros are climbing toward him from below. He cannot outrun them, and he cannot repeat the flap maneuver without risking structural failure. Morrison arrives at exactly the right moment, diving from above to engage the climbing Zeros. His guns flash. 1 Zero breaks off, smoking. The other continues climbing, but Morrison's attack has disrupted its timing. The rest of the Japanese formation is in chaos. The precise geometry of their attack has dissolved into individual dogfights scattered across the sky. The bombers continue toward their target, still in formation, protected by the remaining P-38s who now have manageable numbers to engage. Lightning 2-1, Morrison calls. How did you do that? That turn should have ripped your wings off. Combat flaps. Haynes replies, scanning for more threats. Brief deployment. Creates a temporary change in flight characteristics. That's impossible. Flaps are prohibited above 250 miles per hour. Tell that to the Zero I just shot down. The bomber formation reaches Caravia Bay at 1,245 hours exactly. 11 B-25s pickle their loads on the seaplane base, destroying 14 flying boats and damaging the harbor facilities. Anti-aircraft fire is heavy but inaccurate. 1 bomber takes flak damage in the tail section but remains airworthy. The egress is cleaner. The Japanese fighters have been scattered and bloodied. Several are low on fuel. Others are chasing individual P-38s at low altitude, too far away to threaten the bombers. Haynes and Morrison rejoin the formation, climbing northwest toward friendly territory. At 13:30, they cross into safe airspace. All 11 bombers are accounted for. All 12 escorts return. Mission success with 0 losses. The first time in 2 months that a large formation has hit Rabaul without casualties. During the flight home, Haynes reflects on what happened. The flap deployment worked, but only because it was unexpected. The Japanese pilots had calculated their attacks based on standard P-38 performance. When the Lightning suddenly changed its flight characteristics, their deflection solutions became invalid. The attack formation scattered because individual pilots could no longer predict the escort's flight path. But surprise only works once. Word will spread through Japanese intelligence networks. Pilots will be briefed about American fighters using unusual maneuvers. The technique will lose its effectiveness unless it can be refined, modified, or combined with other unexpected tactics. More importantly, Haynes knows he violated direct orders. Major Klein explicitly forbade high-altitude flap deployment. The successful mission will not change that. If anything, it will highlight the fact that Haynes deliberately disobeyed instructions. He lands at Henderson Field at 14:30, taxis to his revetment, and shuts down the engines. The ground crew swarms over the aircraft, checking for damage. They find 3 bullet holes in the left boom and a fragment tear in the starboard wing. Minor damage for a Rabaul mission. Morrison climbs out of his aircraft and walks over. Bobby, I need to ask you something. That maneuver you pulled, is that something you've been practicing? Haynes hesitates. I've tested it a few times. At altitude. Safe conditions. Does Major Klein know? Another pause. We discussed it. He expressed concerns. Morrison nods slowly. He understands the situation. Well, it worked. Probably saved the whole formation. But you know there's going to be questions. Haynes knows. He also knows that 11 bomber crews are alive tonight because he ignored orders and deployed flaps at 28,000 feet. The mathematics are clear. 77 American airmen are going home to their families instead of dying in the Solomon Sea. As he walks to the debriefing tent, he wonders if Major Klein will see it the same way. The debriefing begins at 1,600 hours. Major Klein sits behind a folding table covered with mission reports and aerial photographs. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison of the bomber wing sits beside him. An intelligence officer with a stenographer's pad takes notes. The tent is stifling, heavy with the afternoon heat and the smell of nervous sweat. The bomber pilots report first. Clean approach, good visibility, accurate bombing. 14 enemy seaplanes destroyed or damaged. Light flak, no fighter interference after the initial engagement. Mission success with 0 losses. Colonel Morrison commends the escort fighters for their aggressive defense of the formation. Then it is the P-38 pilot's turn. Major Klein questions each pilot individually. Standard engagement procedures, ammunition expended, enemy aircraft observed, damage sustained. Everything routine until he reaches Haynes. Lieutenant, your wingman reports that you executed an unusual maneuver during the initial engagement. Please describe what happened. Haynes chooses his words carefully. Sir, I engaged 6 enemy fighters in a diving attack. Used combat flaps to tighten my turning radius during the intercept. The tent goes quiet. The intelligence officer stops writing. Colonel Morrison looks up from his notes. Major Klein's face remains expressionless. Combat flaps at what altitude, Lieutenant? 28,000 feet, sir. And what airspeed? Approximately 300 miles per hour indicated at deployment. Duration? 15 to 20 seconds, sir. Major Klein leans back in his chair. Lieutenant Morrison, please confirm what you observed. Morrison shifts uncomfortably. Sir, Lieutenant Haynes' aircraft appeared to execute a maneuver that allowed him to position behind the lead enemy fighter much faster than standard attack profiles would suggest. The enemy formation scattered without completing their attack on the bombers. Did this maneuver appear to be within the normal flight envelope of the P-38 aircraft? A long pause. No, sir. It did not. Klein turns back to Haynes. Lieutenant, are you familiar with the operational limitations regarding combat flap deployment? Yes, sir. Flaps are prohibited above 250 miles per hour or above 15,000 feet. And you deliberately violated those limitations? I used them tactically, sir. Brief deployment to create a momentary advantage during a critical engagement. Against direct orders not to experiment with unauthorized procedures? Sir, the tactical situation required immediate action. Standard engagement parameters would not have allowed successful intercept of a numerically superior force in attack position. Colonel Morrison intervenes. Major Klein, with respect, the results speak for themselves. This is the first Rabaul mission in 2 months with 0 bomber losses. If Lieutenant Haynes' tactics contributed to that success. Colonel, the results are irrelevant if the tactics are unsound. What worked once under specific conditions may not work again. More importantly, encouraging pilots to violate engineering limitations in combat is a prescription for disaster. The intelligence officer raises his hand. Sir, may I ask about the enemy reaction? Lieutenant Haynes, did the opposing pilots appear surprised by your maneuver? Yes, sir. The lead fighter broke off his attack prematurely. The formation scattered instead of completing coordinated attacks on the bombers. And in your assessment, was this due to the unexpected nature of your flight path? Yes, sir. They had calculated deflection based on standard P-38 performance. When my aircraft suddenly changed its flight characteristics, their solutions became invalid. Klein frowns. Lieutenant, you're suggesting that surprise is a sustainable tactic. But surprise only works if the enemy doesn't know what to expect. Once word spreads through Japanese intelligence networks, your tactical innovation becomes a known quantity. And known quantities get pilots killed. With respect, sir, all tactics depend on surprise to some degree. The enemy adapts, we adapt. The key is maintaining enough variability to prevent predictable responses. And you propose to maintain that variability by ignoring engineering limitations? I propose to use every capability of the aircraft within acceptable risk parameters to accomplish the mission. The debate continues for 20 minutes. Colonel Morrison argues that innovation under pressure is exactly what separates good pilots from great ones. Major Klein counters that unauthorized experimentation violates basic flight discipline and endangers other pilots who might attempt to duplicate unproven techniques. The intelligence officer asks detailed questions about enemy reactions, trying to assess whether the tactic has broader applications. Finally, Klein calls for a break. He speaks privately with Colonel Morrison outside the tent. Their conversation is brief but animated. Morrison gestures toward the aircraft parking area, where ground crews are patching minor battle damage on all 12 P-38s. Klein shakes his head repeatedly. When they return, Klein's decision is clear. Lieutenant Haynes, you will not employ combat flap deployment at altitude again. That is a direct order. You will not discuss the technique with other pilots. You will not attempt to refine or modify the procedure. Any violation will result in immediate grounding and court-martial proceedings. Sir, if the technique proves effective. The technique is unauthorized and dangerous. The fact that it worked once does not validate it for repeated use. Is that understood? Yes, sir. But as the pilots file out of the briefing tent, Morrison approaches Haynes quietly. That was good flying today. Unorthodox, but good. The bomber boys won't forget it. Neither, it turns out, will the P-38 pilots. Despite Klein's prohibition, word spreads through the squadron. Not officially, but in the way that stories always spread among combat pilots. In hushed conversations during maintenance delays, in sketches drawn on mess tent napkins, in the careful analysis that follows every successful mission. Lieutenant Dave Morrison begins asking technical questions about flap deployment characteristics. Lieutenant Bob Parker wonders about the drag penalties and recovery procedures. Lieutenant Jim Walsh wants to know if the technique works with partial flap extension or requires full deployment. Haynes refuses to discuss it. Orders are orders. But other pilots begin their own quiet experiments. Not in combat. No one is that reckless, but during routine patrols and training flights. They discover what Haynes already knows. The P-38 can sustain brief flap deployment at altitude without structural failure. The technique requires precise timing and careful energy management, but it is not impossible. More importantly, they begin to understand the tactical implications. In a turning fight, unexpected changes in flight characteristics can disrupt enemy deflection calculations. The key is not the specific maneuver, but the principle. Anything that makes your aircraft behave differently from what the enemy expects can create momentary tactical advantages. By December, 3 other P-38 pilots in the 9th Fighter Squadron have used variations of the technique in combat. Not high-altitude flap deployment. They are not that brave, but other unexpected maneuvers. Partial flap extension during defensive turns. Asymmetric throttle applications to create yaw moments. Deliberate speed reductions to force overshoot situations. The Japanese notice. Intelligence reports from captured aircrews mention American fighters behaving erratically. Pilots describe P-38s that suddenly change performance characteristics mid-maneuver, making deflection shooting extremely difficult. Some report that American escorts are more aggressive, willing to engage at disadvantageous positions because they have techniques for reversing unfavorable geometry. Major Klein also notices. Loss rates improve marginally, but measurably. December bomber missions suffer 12% casualties instead of the previous 18% average. Not dramatic, but significant enough to appear in monthly squadron reports. When pressed by higher headquarters for explanations, Klein attributes the improvement to better coordination between bombers and escorts, improved training, and declining enemy pilot quality. He does not mention unauthorized tactical experimentation. He does not acknowledge that his own prohibition has been creatively interpreted by pilots who understand the difference between following orders and following the spirit of orders. And he certainly does not admit that Lieutenant Haynes might have been right about acceptable risk parameters. But late at night, when he reviews loss statistics and casualty reports, Klein wonders. 77 aircrew came home from the November 2nd mission because one pilot ignored orders and deployed flaps at 28,000 feet. How many more might come home if other pilots were allowed similar tactical flexibility? It is a question he cannot answer. Innovation and discipline are both necessary for military effectiveness, but they often conflict. Too much innovation leads to chaos. Too little leads to predictability and death. The balance is different for every unit, every situation, every war. For now, Klein maintains his prohibition. Combat flap deployment remains forbidden. But he stops asking too many questions about other experimental techniques, and he stops grounding pilots for minor deviations from standard procedures. It is a quiet compromise between military discipline and combat effectiveness. The technique itself evolves beyond Haynes' original conception. Other squadrons learn variations through informal channels. P-47 pilots discover that propeller pitch changes can create similar surprise effects. P-51 pilots experiment with asymmetric trim settings. The principle spreads even as the specific details remain classified. By war's end, unconventional maneuvering has become an unofficial part of advanced fighter tactics, taught not in formal schools, but in the ready rooms and maintenance hangars where combat pilots share the knowledge that keeps them alive. Haynes flap deployment becomes one technique among many, remarkable not for its technical innovation, but for its demonstration that rigid doctrine can be the enemy of tactical success. The mathematics remain unchanged. Surprise creates opportunities. Opportunities save lives. And sometimes saving lives requires doing things that training manuals say are impossible. Lieutenant Robert Eugene Haynes flies 43 more combat missions after November 2nd. He is credited with 7 confirmed kills, for probables, and 12 aircraft damaged. He never again deploys flaps at altitude, but he continues to experiment with unconventional tactics, always within the bounds of Major Klein's evolving definition of acceptable risk. On February 14, 1944, his aircraft suffers engine failure during a bomber escort mission to Rabaul. The starboard Allison seizes at 22,000 feet, victim of a faulty bearing that escaped detection during routine maintenance. Haynes feathers the propeller and attempts to return to Henderson Field on one engine, but the P-38's asymmetric thrust characteristics make single-engine flight difficult at best. He maintains altitude for 30 minutes before the remaining engine begins to overheat. Coolant pressure drops. Manifold pressure fluctuates. At 8,000 feet over Iron Bottom Sound, with Henderson Field still 40 miles away, he makes the decision that defines the end of his combat career. Instead of bailing out over the shark-infested waters that have claimed so many American pilots, he attempts a controlled ditching near a Navy rescue seaplane. The P-38 hits the water at 90 miles per hour. The aircraft breaks apart on impact, but Haynes survives with a dislocated shoulder, 3 cracked ribs, and a concussion that leaves him unconscious for 6 hours. The PBY crew pulls him from the water 20 minutes after the crash. He spends 2 weeks in a Navy hospital, then another month on limited duty while his injuries heal. The medical board clears him for return to combat, but higher headquarters has different plans. Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, now commanding the bomber wing, requests Haynes as his liaison officer to the escort fighter squadrons. The job involves coordination between bomber and fighter units, tactical planning, and the development of improved escort procedures. It is a staff position, but one that allows Haynes to continue influencing combat tactics from behind a desk. He accepts the assignment with mixed feelings. Flying a desk is safer than flying combat, but it removes him from the experimental edge where real innovation occurs. Still, the position gives him access to after-action reports from multiple squadrons, allowing him to track the evolution and spread of unconventional tactics across the theater. The reports are revealing. By mid-1944, variations of the flap deployment technique appear in combat reports from P-38, P-47, and P-51 units. The specific details vary: altitude, airspeed, duration, but the principle remains consistent. Momentary changes in flight characteristics can disrupt enemy deflection calculations during critical phases of engagement. More importantly, the technique has evolved beyond its original application. Pilots use brief flap deployment during defensive turns to tighten turning radius. They employ asymmetric flap extension to create yaw moments during evasive maneuvers. Some experiment with power reduction combined with flap deployment to create rapid deceleration that forces enemy fighters to overshoot. The Japanese adapt slowly. By late 1944, their tactical manuals include warnings about American fighters using irregular maneuvers designed to confuse deflection calculations. Pilots are briefed to expect unexpected flight characteristics and to maintain firing discipline until they have clear, sustainable shooting solutions. But adaptation is a two-way process. American pilots develop counter-adaptations to Japanese counter-tactics. The innovation cycle accelerates as both sides seek tactical advantages through technical creativity rather than raw numerical superiority. Haynes documents this evolution in a classified report titled Unconventional Maneuvering in Fighter Combat: Tactical Innovation Under Operational Constraints. The report analyzes 67 combat engagements where American pilots used non-standard flight techniques to achieve tactical surprise. The conclusions are carefully worded to avoid explicit endorsement of unauthorized procedures, but the implications are clear. Rigid adherence to doctrine can be as dangerous as complete abandonment of it. The report circulates through higher headquarters, but never becomes official policy. The techniques it describes remain unofficial, passed along through informal networks, refined through trial and error, validated through survival rather than systematic testing. After the war, Haynes remains in the military through the transition to jet aircraft. He becomes a test pilot, ironically working to establish the operational limitations that define safe flight envelopes for new aircraft. His experience with unauthorized experimentation gives him unique insights into the relationship between engineering constraints and tactical requirements. He retires as a lieutenant colonel in 1962, after 18 years of service that spans the transition from propeller-driven fighters to supersonic jets. His final assignment is as chief test pilot for the F-4 Phantom II program, where he helps establish the operational procedures that will guide a new generation of fighter pilots. His post-military career is quietly distinguished. He works as an aeronautical engineer for Boeing, contributing to the design of commercial aircraft that incorporate lessons learned from military aviation. He teaches part-time at the University of Washington, passing along to civilian students the mathematical precision and experimental curiosity that served him in combat. He publishes no memoirs. He gives no interviews to aviation magazines. He attends squadron reunions infrequently, preferring to let others tell the war stories while he listens from the back of the room. When younger pilots ask about his combat experiences, he deflects attention to the technical aspects of aircraft design, the evolution of tactical doctrine, the importance of understanding engineering limitations before attempting to exceed them. Robert Eugene Haynes dies in 1987 at age 66, victim of the lung cancer that claims so many veterans of a war fought with leaded gasoline and asbestos insulation. His obituary in the Seattle Times mentions his military service and his post-war engineering career, but it does not mention the November afternoon when he deployed flaps at 28,000 feet and saved 77 American lives. The technique survives him. Modern fighter aircraft with computer-controlled flight systems can execute maneuvers that would have been impossible in 1943, but the principle remains. Tactical surprise through unexpected flight characteristics can create momentary advantages that determine the outcome of air combat engagements. Flight training curricula now include sections on unconventional maneuvering, though the techniques are taught within carefully defined safety parameters rather than discovered through unauthorized experimentation. Test pilots systematically explore the boundaries of flight envelopes, ensuring that tactical innovation occurs within acceptable risk parameters rather than in the desperate improvisation of combat. The lesson is institutional as well as technical. Innovation requires both creativity and discipline, the willingness to challenge doctrine balanced by respect for the engineering realities that define the possible. Haynes embodied that balance, pushing boundaries while understanding consequences, experimenting with caution, surviving through knowledge rather than luck. His gravestone in Arlington National Cemetery lists his rank, his service dates, and his decorations. Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with 3 oak leaf clusters, Purple Heart. It does not mention that he violated direct orders to save lives, that he proved engineering limitations could be exceeded under specific conditions, that he helped establish the principle that doctrine serves tactics rather than the reverse. But the men who flew with him remember. And in the ready rooms and briefing halls where new generations of fighter pilots learn their trade, the story survives. Sometimes the most important lesson is knowing when to ignore the manual. The mathematics of air combat have not changed since 1943. Physics still governs lift and drag. Geometry still determines firing solutions. Energy still trades between altitude and airspeed according to immutable laws that no amount of courage can alter. But the application of those laws, the creative interpretation of physical constraints, the tactical exploitation of engineering margins, remains as much art as science. Robert Haynes understood this. He knew that the difference between doctrine and death often measured in seconds, in degrees of turn radius. In the momentary confusion of an enemy pilot whose deflection calculations suddenly became invalid. His innovation was not the flap deployment itself. Student pilots learned that maneuver in primary training. His innovation was the recognition that techniques forbidden in one context might be essential in another, that engineering limitations written for peacetime operations might not apply to wartime emergencies, that survival sometimes requires doing what the manual says is impossible. Modern military aviation has institutionalized this insight. Test pilots systematically explore flight envelopes. Tactics instructors teach adaptive maneuvering. Computer-controlled flight systems allow aircraft to operate safely at the edge of aerodynamic possibility. But the principle remains unchanged. Innovation occurs at the intersection of technical knowledge and tactical necessity. The lesson extends beyond aviation. In every field where human lives depend on split-second decisions, surgery, emergency response, law enforcement, practitioners must balance adherence to proven procedures against the creative adaptation required by unique circumstances. Too much flexibility leads to chaos. Too little leads to preventable failures. Haynes found that balance through mathematical precision and experimental courage. He tested his theories safely before applying them in combat. He understood the risks and accepted them when the alternative was watching friends die. He violated orders to save lives, then accepted the consequences without complaint or self-justification. The 77 aircrew who survived the November 2nd mission never knew that their lives depended on a few seconds of unauthorized flap deployment. They landed at Henderson Field, filed their reports, and prepared for the next mission without understanding that they had witnessed tactical innovation under fire. Most never learned that their survival required one pilot's willingness to ignore everything he had been taught about high-altitude flight limitations. But their survival mattered more than their knowledge. Their families received letters instead of telegrams. Their children grew up with fathers. Their stories continued beyond that afternoon over Rabaul, when mathematics and courage combined to prove that sometimes the most ridiculous move is the one that saves your life. The sky above the Solomon Islands is quiet now. Henderson Field has returned to jungle. The coral runways where P-38s once scrambled are overgrown with tropical vegetation. But the lesson remains, encoded in flight training curricula and tactical doctrine, validated by subsequent generations of pilots who learned that survival often depends on doing the unexpected thing at exactly the right moment. Some innovations are recorded in technical manuals. Others are written in the physics of desperation and remembered in the mathematics of survival. Robert Haynes chose physics over doctrine when the two conflicted. 77 American airmen went home because he understood that engineering limitations serve tactical requirements, not the reverse, and that sometimes saving lives requires proving that the impossible is merely improbable, waiting for the right pilot at the right moment with the courage to pull the forbidden lever and prove the manual wrong. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.